Hi everyone, in today's lesson we're going to analyze trig equations. So far, up until this point, we've analyzed trig graphs. So today we're going to set the foundation for analyzing trig equations so that we can eventually graph these things ourselves. So we've written trig functions in the form f of x equals a sine bx plus or minus d, or they've been written in the form a cos bx plus or minus d. So let's just review the parts that we know. The absolute value of a, the number in front, is the amplitude. B is the frequency, or sometimes referred to as cycles, or the number of cycles you'll see between 0 and 2 pi. And the d is our vertical shift. And remember, the vertical shift is also referred to as the equation of the midline. And remember that if I have a plus d, that means we are moving up. If I have a minus d, that means we would have moved down. So up until this point, we've given you a graph and you've calculated the amplitude by looking at it. You've calculated the frequencies by counting the cycles between 0 and 2 pi, and you found the equation of the midline by looking at the vertical shift. So there's other things that we can actually get from this equation. We can calculate the period. So period is how long it takes the graph to complete one full cycle. And we can calculate that by the formula 2 pi divided by b, where b is the frequency. And we can also calculate something called the interval. And the interval is defined as period over 4. And basically what the interval does, it tells us what we're going to set up our x-axis. So this is our x-axis scale. And this will make more sense as we graph it, but for today's lesson, I'd like to just practice, if I give you an equation, can you find all of these parts? So let's do an example. Okay, example number 1. Let's say we have f of x equals -3 sine 2x and then plus 1. So I'm going to ask you to calculate some things. So the first thing I'm going to ask for is the amplitude. The next thing I'm going to ask for is the frequency, or the number of cycles. Then I'll ask you for the period, the interval, the maximum value, and then the minimum value. So if I'm asking you to find all of these things, there's a little acronym that'll help us solve for it. It's called ACPI. All cats play indoors is the best that we can come up with it to remember it, but all cats play indoors works. A stands for the amplitude. So if I'm asking you to find the amplitude, obviously we are looking at the front number and we're taking its absolute value. So the absolute value of -3 will be our amplitude, which is in fact 3. So I can go ahead and say amplitude is 3. Then I asked you, the C stands for the number of cycles. Number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. That can be found by the number next to the x, which is here in fact 2. Period we defined in the previous slide as 2 pi over b, where b is the number of cycles. Since we just found the cycles to be 2, it's 2 pi over 2, which we can simplify by crossing out the 2's, and we're just left with pi. I stands for interval, which we discussed before as period over 4. So we just calculated that the period is pi, so we're just going to divide that by 4. So pi over 4 would be our interval, how we would set up our x-axis. So let's go ahead with our ACPI. Can we answer these questions? So we already got the amplitude. Frequency, or cycles, is found by looking at this C, so that's 2. Period, we can look here. After doing the algebra, we found that the period was pi. Interval we found was pi over 4. And then the last bits of information are the max and min values. Now, I didn't give you a definition of what a max and min value is yet, but let's see if we can figure out just by looking at a graph. So let's just say I have a graph here, and this is my midline. I don't know if it's at the X and Y axis. We don't know exactly where it is. It's just a midline. And let's just say I graph a negative sign graph, right? Looks something like this. We know that the max value, which is up here, is properly spaced over the midline. More specifically, the amplitude value, right? So if you take the midline, add the amplitude, you'll get the maximum. If you take the midline and subtract the amplitude, you'll get the minimum. So midline, take away the amplitude, you'll get our minimum. So I kind of just derived the two formulas. Max is defined as the midline plus the amplitude. Now I'm just going to make sure we know to take the absolute value. And the minimum value is found by taking the midline and subtracting the amplitude. So in this case, the midline we know is our vertical shift, right? So this is our midline, aka our vertical shift. So in this first problem, we're going to take the midline, which is 1, and we're going to add the absolute value of the amplitude, and the amplitude is 3. So 1 plus 3 gives me 4. The midline, 1, minus the amplitude of 3, will give me a negative 2 for my minimum. So, a lot to find, but we can do it, just to summarize, with ACPI, and then knowing these two formulas for the max and the min. Okay, let's try another example. So let's say we have f of x equals 5 cos 1/2 x, and then minus 6. So I want to find all of the things that we found before. So let's start with ACPI. ACPI. And then let's find our max and our min values. Okay? So remember, A stands for amplitude. Remember the number in front, the absolute value of A is my amplitude. The number next to the X is my B, or my frequency, or my number of cycles. And the negative 6 is my vertical shift, or in other words, my new midline. So, absolute value of my amplitude. So if 5 is my A value, the absolute value of 5, which is 5, is my amplitude. C is my cycles or frequency, which can be found by taking the number in front of the X. So that's 1/2. Period is defined as 2 pi over B, where B is the number of cycles, right? So 2 pi divided by 1/2 will be my period. Now notice we're dividing fractions. We're going to keep the 2 pi over 1, change the division to a multiplication, and flip the last fraction. Remember division. We keep, change the division to multiplication, and we flip the last fraction to 2 over 1. So for those that need to write it, KCF, keep, change, flip, and then we multiply fractions straight across, tops with tops, bottoms with bottoms. 2 pi times 2 is 4 pi, and 1 times 1 is 1, so that will reduce to 4 pi. Remember my interval is the period divided by 4. So here my period is 4 pi divided by 4. The 4's will cancel, and my interval is left to be pi. Now, to find the max or the min, remember, to find the max, we take the midline and add the absolute value of the amplitude. To take the minimum value, we find the midline and subtract the amplitude. So, the max value, midline, remember the negative 6 is my vertical shift or my midline. So we're going to take negative 6 and add the amplitude, which is 5. That gives me negative 1. My minimum is the midline, -6, minus my amplitude, which is 5. So -6 minus 5 is -11. Okay, so for example number 3, I'd like you to actually try it on your own. So let's say we have f of x equals 4 sine 2/3 x minus 3. Find everything that we found in the last example. Pause the video until you've done so, and then hit resume when you're ready for the answer. Okay, here are your answers. Your amplitude should have been 4. I took the absolute value of the number in front. The cycles is your b value, so I took the 2/3 in front of the x. Period is found by taking 2 pi over b, where b is the number of cycles. So I did 2 pi divided by 2/3. I saw a division here, so I have to keep change, flip. Kept the 2 pi over 1, changed the division to a multiplication, and flipped the 2/3 to 3 over 2. Multiplied straight across. 2 pi times 3 is 6 pi. 1 times 2 is 2. 6 divided by 3 gave me 3 pi. Then I found my interval, which is period divided by 4. Period is 3 pi. Then I just divided it by 4. No simplification necessary. Maximum value is found by taking the midline plus the amplitude. So the midline is your vertical shift here, so -3. Add the amplitude, which is 4. So I get 1. Found the minimum by taking the midline and subtracting the amplitude. Midline again is -3. It's your vertical shift. And then I'm subtracting my amplitude, which is 4. And that gives me a minimum value of -7. All right, that's it for today. If you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to jot them down and then ask us in class tomorrow. Okay, have a good night.